So it's interesting to me that you can take something like Stoicism, or certainly a book built on Stoic principles, and it can transcend the medium, right? So like you can learn Stoicism through obviously books, which a lot of people do. You can learn it through conversations with people, and now you can learn it through graphic novels. So I'm very interested in this idea because it seems like certain mediums speak to different people. So what do you think about that in terms of like the spirit of things transcending the medium?
Yeah, I mean, we see that in over the course of my life. I guess I've seen a lot of examples of people getting into things like Stoicism in surprising ways. I remember, and this is ages ago, and I forget now how long ago this was, when Gladiator came out, which was about 22 years ago. Like, when Gladiator, so there might be people listening to your podcast that weren't even born when Gladiator came out, which seems weird to me. But when Gladiator came out, because Richard Harris plays Marcus Aurelius in the first act, it doesn't really mention the meditations or Stoicism, but loads of people went out, like looked up Marcus Aurelius and read the meditations. There was a big surge of interest in it after that movie came out, and they just thought it was cool. Like you were saying, you said Marcus Aurelius was cool. I love Marcus Aurelius, and I wouldn't normally brag about something like that, but I kind of feel confident saying I probably know about as much about him as anyone else alive today, because I've spent so much time writing about him and studying him. But I think of him more as a bit of a massive nerd. Like, he was kind of cool in a way, like, but he was also an incredibly nerdy guy and kind of known for it. He was really an eternal student and stuff. And he's kind of like you were hinting earlier. He's also a kind of gateway drug to getting into Socrates, who's a very different character, like a whole different ballgame. But the graphic novel format, it's very similar to a movie in some ways. Writing a graphic novel is very similar to creating a storyboard or writing a script for a movie, right down to the fact that you would describe the panels in ways that you would describe the angle of a camera shot and stuff like that. So it's different. It's different in some ways from writing a prose book. In terms of the audience, I don't know. Like I'm waiting with bated breath to find out what the audience is. People falsely, I think, assume that kids will read it, or not false, but not entirely accurately, because graphic novels like this tend to be aimed at slightly older teenagers, maybe at least. It's probably not suitable for small kids. It's not like the Beano or the Dandy or whatever, like there's quite a lot of violence in ancient Rome, and there's some nudity and some pretty hardcore philosophizing about, coming to terms with your own mortality and a graveyard and stuff like that, and guys getting crucified and getting their heads chopped off and things like that. So it's not like a kid's comic book, but I think it will appeal maybe to a slightly younger demographic. And, I kind of get the feeling that different people are reading it than would normally read self-help books and things like that. Actually, what I would say, one of my main observations about Stoicism is it's self-help for people that don't like self-help, in a sense. When I teach about Stoicism, often people in the audience will tell me that they've never read any self-help books or anything like that, because they'll say, I'm not into that kind of stuff. Like, there's usually a few tough guys in the audience, so I don't read stuff like that. Usually guys, sometimes it's women. Often when I've been talking to the police force or the military or whatever, those guys are like, I don't read self-help books. But they love Marcus Aurelius, and then reading Marcus Aurelius and Stoicism kind of gets them into learning about CBT and stuff like that. When I taught psychotherapy, and they would, I would be amazed if someone in the audience hadn't read self-help books. So it's quite a contrast to me. And so what that suggests is the good side of that is that psychological self-improvement techniques and therapy concepts and stuff might be reaching a whole sector of society that they hadn't reached before. And that's of a lot of interest to me as a psychotherapist, because I know one of the problems with psychotherapy, we worry a lot as psychotherapists about how to make the techniques more effective and how to make the treatment work, but there's a more fundamental problem, which is a lot of people just never go for treatment in the first place.
Yeah.
Right? And the main demographic, actually, that don't go for treatment is men suffering from social anxiety, who, I guess, you might guess by the nature of that disorder, there's kind of shame and self-consciousness feature prominently in it. So we know, that's one of the groups that are least likely to actually seek out therapy and go and have CBT or something like that.
Yeah.
But some of these guys go see Gladiator, or they read books about history or whatever, and that kind of gets them somehow into Stoicism and learning about techniques that might benefit them. So I find that very rewarding and exciting. It means like this is kind of fresh blood for therapy. Like these are people that really need help, that haven't got any strategies that they've learned from stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So I think it's interesting, and maybe people do take something different. The ancient Stoics thought the best way to learn Stoicism wasn't from lectures. Actually, I think it's pretty clear. And they state this explicitly at times, that they think the best way to learn Stoicism is by making the acquaintance of somebody who's more experienced in practicing it. So, for example, they all thought like knowing Socrates or knowing Zeno personally, like would be like the best way, like having a kind of role model or a mentor, like that you could make a personal acquaintance with, was much better than just reading books and stuff like that. So it's hard to do that today, but maybe a small, tiny step closer to that is if we can really visualize what Marcus Aurelius, for instance, might have been like as a living, breathing human being, and then we put flesh and blood, we put a human face on Stoicism rather than it just being something kind of abstract that we read about in a book.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. And I do think like there's something about a story that appeals to a lot of people. And it's interesting. I never thought about it in sort of like the masculine macho, don't want to help themselves kind of thing. But stories seem to be a great way that men in particular sort of learn some of those lessons, because it's no longer weird. Like, not that it's weird to go to therapy or anything like that, but that's sort of how they perceive it. Whereas, okay, if you go to a superhero movie, if you read a cool book on Marcus Aurelius, a graphic novel that's telling this interesting story with lessons infused to it, it's a little bit more, let's say, approachable and palatable for a lot of people, which is good.
A different group, a different demographic, it affects them in a different way.